I have known most of you by emails. Yes, I'm the person receiving the attendance forms and sending you the invitation letters. It's good to see you here, and welcome to Beijing, welcome to Peking University. I think for most of the overseas attendees, it's your first time to be here. Maybe it's not very easy to stay in such a purely Chinese language environment, but don't worry. It's said by Confucius. Do you know Confucius? That's yeah, it's said by Confucius. How happy we are to make friends from afar. That means 有朋自远方来，不亦乐乎. So we have a good tradition in China to be kind to people, friends from afar. So if you meet any problems here, please feel free to tell people around. And we also have several student volunteers. Their contact information have been provided on the website. So hope you have great time here and wish great success for the summer school. Thank you very much.
Okay, now it's my turn to say welcome to Peking University to the AGI Summer School. My name is Pei Wang. I'm one of the instructors. First, a few small things. One is we have wireless connection. The information is here in case you haven't found it yet. Okay, network, password. Second thing, the schedule. I assume you all already know this is the summer school website, right? We are still following this schedule, so this is still up to date. You see there's 3 short courses. So basically, the first 5 or 6 days is usually in the morning is my course. In the afternoon is Chris Thorson. He is already here and he will show up later today. And then Ben Gozo will be here next week. He will cover the last 3 days. And then the final day will be presentation and discussion, which I have mentioned in previous email to all of you. What else? Another thing is we reserved another small classroom for the evening optional discussions and so on, because we have a lot of materials to cover. Okay. So I'm afraid during the lectures, at least in my case, short questions are always welcome. Any moment you can just raise your hand and ask me something. But if you really have you want to have a long discussion, we probably don't have the time for that. Or some of you, I know for sure, you already have a solution for AGI. Okay, you want to share with us. Well, we will have to schedule another time for that. It's just because of the time constraint. So we already mentioned in some of the email. So if any of you want to have that kind of discussion, and we can make arrangement for the evening. So at least this evening, I will be there to be some kind of office hour or informal discussion with any of you if you want to show up. Also, we can talk during the break, and lunchtime, dinner time, and so on. Hopefully, by the end of the semester or the course, whatever you call it, we will know each other much better. So I think it's better for me to actually go into the material rather than talking about this. You see all these 3 are linked here. Each of them, under this readings, will link to a separate web page for the course. And also all the reading materials will be online. Okay. So for example, in my case, all the stuff you will need. is here. As far as you have your laptop with you, you don't really need to print out materials. So let's see. For me, in the first couple of mornings, my schedule will basically be, I will talk roughly for 3 hours. We are going to have a break somewhere in the middle, for 15 minutes or something like that. And the first day is always special. I'm going to go through 2 introductions. The first is the introduction about AGI. The second one will be an introduction about my own AGI project. Okay. That's also something we discussed among the instructors. We think each of us clearly is going to focus on our own research. On the other hand, we also try to give you our own vision about the whole field. So to achieve some kind of balance between the detailed stuff and the big picture. So that's how I'm going to arrange my material. So first, that's the page linked from the schedule. Artificial general intelligence, a gentle introduction. That's from my personal point of view. Okay. So that's, you see, it's recently updated, even though I have already have this web page online for several years. Some of you may have already noticed that, but this is a new version, hopefully better one. First, I'm going to go through a very quick historical background introduction without bothering with all the details. So I assume all of you are already familiar with artificial intelligence or AI to a certain degree. Okay? You know, at the very beginning, it just after the computer was invented, people begin to realize that computer can do much more than just numerical calculation. Okay? Throwing all kinds of coding technique, we can process symbols or many other stuff. So it's very natural that several people actually raised this possibility that is whether all human mental activity or what we call intelligence or cognition, whatever you call it, whether can all those things be done by a computer. That's basically the idea of artificial intelligence. Okay. So at the very beginning, that many people are very optimistic about this, think it can be done. So if you're familiar with the early literature of the field, you'll see actually AI was about to build a thinking machine or to build a computer system which is comparable to the human mind in general, in a certain sense. Okay. But pretty soon, it turned out to be much harder a task, okay, than most people expected. Okay. There are several well-known projects. They all kind of failed in different way. They didn't make it, and AI, to a certain extent, become a joke in the academic world. Okay? People say, "Oh, you guys said you can do this, you can do that." Nothing happened. So it's a result partly because of that. AI as a field, well, it still keeps the name artificial intelligence, but in reality, they have turned into something very different from the original plan. Okay? That is, they tend to domain-specific and special-purpose solutions. Okay? I assume most of you have taken an AI course at college level at least. If you pick a typical AI textbook, you will see that's a reality. You have a lot of chapters, each chapter on a different topic. They basically have nothing to do, or very little to do with each other. Okay? So that's kind of like the reality of the field of AI. It's still the case. If you attend, for example, some of you may attend later to attend AGI this year in Beijing, right, after the AGI conference. You will see that's still the case. If you walk into one room, they're talking about planning. You go into another room, they talk about natural language processing. Another one will talk about robotics. There anything that related those things to each other? Yes, some, but not much. Okay. So is that a problem? Well, it depends on who you ask. Okay, here I give you the link of two very typical opinions. Some people, especially some of the major figures in the mainstream AI say that's actually a sign that AI has progressed, it's matured. Okay? And we have given up the earlier, say, sci-fi dream. Okay, we become actually a science or adopt the scientific method. You see, after decades of clearly non-scientific methods. Okay, so that's a good thing. On the other hand, you see this quotation is from an interview of Marvin Minsky. I assume many of you know he's one of the founding fathers of the field. And they are very disappointed, say that AI is brain dead. Okay, they actually turned into something else, giving up the original goal. So no matter which opinion you take, okay, one reality is even the people in the mainstream AI, they agree that there are problems given this situation. One problem is AI people always complain their work has not been recognized properly from the outside. Okay? Whenever you solve a problem, people say, oh, that's not intelligence, that's just programming. Okay? So where is the AI? It will become an issue. And another thing is also the internal fragmentation, which I just mentioned. All the fields have little to do with each other. Okay? So this link is linked to a documentation that one presidential address made by a former AAAI president who talked about this kind of thing, how to put the AI field back together. Okay, recently, there are actually several other people mentioned about the same. So it's a big problem that is AI. Yeah, it's, in a sense, it's not really one field, but a whole bunch of loosely related fields. So that's kind of like the big picture background. But roughly 10 years ago, we begin to see a change. For several reasons, and more or less accidentally, many people begin to say, now we should actually try to put things together. Okay, here I have some links for detailed information on that topic, and you may want to take a look. And roughly in the same time, a whole bunch of new books show up with very brief titles and new approach. And we are going to mention some of them in the future. Also, there are a bunch of other books I said here. You may have heard about some of them. For example, this one is pretty well known. Okay? They're much less technical, but more influential in a sense to the public opinion. So overall, people have the feeling that probably we should actually go back to the original dream of AI to talk about. Also, with that's another reason is with the progress of computer hardware and other fields like network, so that people think now the time is really here, okay, for us to seriously talking about general purpose system or integrated AI or human level AI, a different phrase I use. So partly because of that, we see the first group of meetings, those kind of things was not there, say, 10 years ago or 20 or 30 years ago. Okay, certainly they're here. Again, now people can begin to talk about the general purpose system. One of them is the very first AGI meeting that happened in 2006. It's invited workshop. Okay. And after that, we see a relatively repeat progress in the field. For example, AGI, or Artificial General Intelligence, now we have a regular annual conference. The first one is 2008 in Memphis. And you already know that sixth AGI conference will be here right after the summer school. So I actually strongly recommend most of you to stay whenever possible, so you can have a combined image about this field. Okay. In the summer school, we are going to introduce 3 projects in detail, and in the conference, you are going to see much more but each of them will be only briefly covered. So give you a better idea. And also we have the journal of AGI, which started in 2009, and recently we also registered a society, and many of you have already enrolled as a member, which will give you some benefit, for example, free conference, right? Also I want to mention a couple of other small community. They all started a little bit later than the AGI community with a very similar motivation, but slightly different focus. Okay? You see the so-called BICA community now, they also have an annual conference with their own journal and society, and a couple of others. Okay. And also at least a couple of more recent books, including one by myself, which will be the teaching material of this summer school. That's my most recent work. So that's a very rough historical background. Any quick question? Again, for the long discussion, we can do it later. So now I'm going to move into the second section that will be the focus of today's introduction. That's AGI overview from my point of view. Okay. And by the way, Chris is already here, and in the afternoon he will give you his version, and the next week surely Bengozo will give his version. You're going to see, I will let you know in advance that they are not the same. Okay, we still have, each of us have a slightly different opinion, but clearly on the other hand, you will also see the overlap. Okay, so the following overview only represents my personal opinion about what is AGI and how to do AGI. So first, what is AGI? Well, again, there is no widely accepted definition, but because of the background introduction, I think you can already have a feeling about what this is about, what makes it different from what you usually call AI. Okay? So you'll see basically, I'm going to say there's three major points from my point of view. Okay? One is the G letter, of course. We want to understand intelligence is a general purpose capability. It's not something you do in one domain or something you do in another domain. And also, each of the AGI projects try to approach the problem of intelligence or cognition using either a holistic or an integrative attitude. It's basically say that we want to do the whole thing. Okay, we don't want to do just natural language processing and we forget about everything else. Or we just do, say, robotics and make a very flexible body and we don't care about the mind. That's not AGI. That's AI in the current sense. Okay. Also, that's something also that a major factor that combine put the community together is this group of people typically believe in the near future it's possible to actually build something which is comparable to the human mind in such a certain sense. So they're in general much more optimistic about what can be done compared to average AI researcher. And also, there's several similar, sometimes better known phrase, say strong AI or human level AI or complete AI or AI completeness or thinking machine and so on. They are more or less about the same thing. But after compare them, we think AGI is the least evil one. Okay, even though it's not perfect, still we think it stress the right factor, even though. You can still say it's not that good, but you have to use something, right, to just separate this type of research from the other or more normal AI research. Later we'll see they're still very different. Okay. So again, there's no definition, but there is a difference. And what is AGI? Well, that's another issue has been discussed in AI before. Is that a branch of science or is it a branch of engineering? Well, actually, it's both. That's why this field is more difficult than most of the other fields. Okay? It's both a science and engineering. Why? Because you see, think about it. Even if just according to the very rough definition or description about the problem, you know that for a work to be called AGI in general, they need to, again, my opinion, include something or some result at different level of description. Okay. First, clearly you need to have some kind of theory about what is intelligence or how intelligence works. And that work clearly should come from the study about human intelligence because that's kind of the only form of intelligence we know relatively well. Okay? Well, not completely, but better than the other form. That's where all the AI or AGI work starts, for sure. Okay? But then, yeah, you have a theory. Basically, that theory will be described using some kind of human language, right? English, Chinese, whatever. And then usually that's not enough. That's not accurate enough if you really want to reproduce that thing in computer, right? So we like philosophy, but this is not pure philosophy is not enough here. Okay? So typically we will need a formal model. And by the way, in this year's AGI conference, we have a special workshop just talk about formal models, whether we really need it, and what kind of formal model we need. Okay. But at least currently, as far as I know, most people will say, yes, we do need a formal model. Okay. So that will describe the theory or your theory in a much more accurate form. Okay. So other people can really debate or argue with you, rather than just use some fuzzy form term in natural language, then no one knows what you exactly mean. And finally, that's not enough. You need to build it, meaning that you need to implement it in a computer system. Okay? Most of the AGI work still using general purpose computer like this one, but some other people will also use special purpose hardware, meaning some kind of robot. Okay? So you need to have all of them. So you see that at the same time, you need to be a very good or reasonably good philosopher, psychologist, mathematician, maybe logician, computer engineer, maybe mechanical engineer at the same time. Okay, that's why AGI is not an easy job, no matter what's your educational background. Okay. So also, this is a book chapter. That's actually the introduction of the first AGI workshop proceedings, written by me and Ben Gozzo. In this book chapter, we try to provide a short answer to the common objection to the field of AGI, which is still, a lot. Most people, frankly, in the AI field still doesn't believe AGI can be done, or now is the right time to target that problem. Okay? So here we made some very brave position statement about why we don't agree with them, which I'm not going to repeat here. We don't have the time. So if you're interested, okay, you can take a look. But clearly, we haven't settled down all the problems, which will not happen until actually someone actually build an AGI. Okay? So that's a very brief description about what AGI is. Then let's move into what I believe to be the fundamental AGI questions. Why I write AI/AGI? Because according to the previous description, you see that originally AI and AGI are actually the same thing. What we call AGI actually, in another sense, is to go back to the original form of AI. We don't like the current AI that much because they have given up the dream. Okay? We want to go back. So So those discussion will also apply to AI in a more general sense. And the following four are the questions I summarize, which I believe every AI or AGI researcher will have to answer in some form, as far as you claim you're working in the field. Okay. The first question, of course, is what do we mean by AI, right? We know that there is no widely accepted definition, but you do need to have some idea, right? Otherwise, how can you say you're doing it? So we need some kind of working definition of AI or intelligence, which will become the foundation of all the following discussion. Okay. So that's the first question you can ask every AGI or AI researcher. What do we mean by that? Roughly speaking, we know what you mean. But accurately speaking, what do you really mean? And later we're going to see much more about that. And the second question is, okay, I see what you mean. Is that kind of thing, can we do it? Is that possible? You may have heard about many people have claimed to prove that AI is impossible in principle. Okay? It just cannot be done for some fundamental philosophical reason. Okay? If that's the case, then that's the end of the story. Okay? But is that really the case? Okay? So that's the second question. If you still want to do this research, it basically means you don't believe any of the proof that have been proposed so far. Okay? Otherwise, why waste your time here? But this question clearly is based on the first one. Okay? Because different definition, of course, may have different possibility, right? Some version of AI is possible, some other version of AI maybe it's indeed impossible. Okay? So it depends on what you mean. And then after the second question, we have the third question. Okay, now you know maybe what you said is indeed possible. But how to actually do it is a different story. Okay? To say something is in principle possible, it doesn't really answer the question like what's the practically plausible approach, or what's the most efficient or quick approach to actually do it. Okay? So the answer to the third question will have to be more or less technical. I will relate the theoretical idea to the practical work in the field, which again we're going to say much more. And finally, that's the question that, okay, I see. You explain and your approach seems reasonable to me, at least in the moment. But do we really want to do that? Okay, there's a lot of things we know can be done, but we don't want to do it. Okay? This also, recently in the field of AI, there's another group of people who are mostly interested in this kind of topic. I know some of you here are familiar with that discussion. It's about whether, you guys are actually building Terminators or Matrix, that kind of evil computer. Okay. So I know you guys are smart enough to do it, but please don't. Okay. Yeah, some people seriously actually submit papers to the AGI journal say that you guys should actually stop here, otherwise you're going to kill all my grandchildren. That kind of thing. Okay. We cannot always take that as a joke. We have to give an answer. So I also know that about 10 days from now, there will be a Community Plus meeting here in Beijing, which organized by some of the people in the AGI community, which will basically address that aspect, the social impact of AGI. Okay? So I guess those four questions every researcher or people interested in the field will have to ask at some moment in the discussion. What's the answer? Well, my own answers, very brief one, has been published somewhere online, and you can take a look. And in the following, I will try to summarize the answers to the first and the third question. That is, what do you want to do and how to do it? Okay. Second, can we do it? Or the last one is, should we do it? I will just say that most people in the field will say yes to both of them. Clearly, otherwise we are not going to be here, right? But if you want to discuss those things, we can talk about it later. Okay? That's a little bit beyond the current coverage of the course. So I'm going to talk about what is AI with a little bit more detail, or AGI, and how to do it. And that's not just my opinion, but it's my summary of the field. Okay? Other people will give you a different vision. So what's the research objective? Well, I already mentioned AGI means to treat intelligence as one problem, as a whole. Okay? But still, it haven't answered the question, what is the problem? Even though we agree that's one problem. Well, we can go a little bit further. We also agree on something else. That is, the best example of intelligence is nothing but this, right? That's the best example. That's basically what every people agree. So that, yeah, you want to build a computer system which is similar to the human mind. But in what sense? The human mind, just like many other things in the world, can be described from different perspectives, a different level of description. And the result very often are very different. Okay? So you'll see here, the first very obvious approach is to say, okay, you agree this is the best form of intelligence we know. Okay, it's produced by what? Mostly by the human brain. So some people argue that's the safest approach. That is, to simulate the human brain with as much detail as possible. Okay, their argument is actually pretty simple. You see, everything in the world, in principle, can be simulated or modeled to any level of detail, if with the progress of the computer technology, of course. They don't think human brain should be an exception. Okay, so if that's the case, if we can actually simulate everything involved in the thinking process, for example, every neuron and a huge number of them all connected together in the right way, why not? We should be able to get a working mind. Okay, so you see, that's kind of like the rationale of this approach. They say, okay, at least we have an existence proof for that approach to work, which is already produced by the evolution process. Okay, so that why not just follow that? And so this group of people tend to be more kind of like biologically inspired. They learn a lot from neuroscience, biology, and so on. And I also gave you a couple of typical examples with the project of that nature, so that you can take a look. This is IBM project, which they spend a lot of money to try to build a hardware, special purpose hardware, to simulate the human brain on a large scale. Okay. So what's the challenge? The challenge is many people who is following other approaches say, well, we agree, you guys, maybe you can do it. But it's clearly not the most efficient way to do it. Okay, why? Because there are many biological details which are probably neither necessary nor possible to be simulated in a computer. Because after all, a computer is not a biological system. Okay, you can simulate a biological system. Now, of course, very often go back to the philosophical discussion, what is a simulation? Is a simulation a real thing or just a fake thing? Okay, but anyway, maybe it's not completely necessary to do that. Okay? So if we are talking about the most efficient way to do AI, maybe we will do something else. So that will naturally lead to the second approach. That's what I call the behavioral approach. Think about it. How do I know you guys are intelligent, or how do you guys know I'm intelligent if I'm not completely unintelligent according to your standard? Well, you cannot see my brain, right, usually. What you can directly observe is the behavior. Okay? So, again, that's something computer people are very familiar with. That is, I can just treat a process or an object or a system as a black box. I don't really care what's the internal structure. Okay? As far as the input-output relationship or the outside behavior are the same, I will say these two system behavior on the behavior level, they're equivalent to each other. That's the idea of the Turing test. Right? I assume many of you already heard about that. So if a system talks like a human, it's intelligent. It's good enough. Okay? I don't care whether there simulated neurons within the system. That's irrelevant. I'm not saying it's impossible. Okay? It's irrelevant to the problem. So to a large extent, the AI community, from the very beginning, at least most of the people in the community, accept the assumption that human intelligence is just one way to implement the general concept of intelligence. Okay? So they will rather explore some other possibility, which in the detail are completely different from the brain. They think that's actually the fun part of the AI work. Okay? If we realize that finally we have to duplicate the brain to all the details, to many people, including me, okay, I would say that's boring. That's actually a failure of AI because that actually shows there is no other way to do it. Okay? What we are really interested in is whether there are other ways to do the same thing. That other way should be closer to the very nature of a computer system, given its electrical, silicon-based, foundation, which is clearly very different from a real brain. Okay? So you see, those kind of people tend to get their inspiration not from biology or neuroscience anymore, but more from psychology and linguistics and the other field which study human behavior. Okay? They try to build a mathematical model and a computer model to do the same thing. So you'll see sometimes it's called cognitive modeling, and if you attend, say, conference on cognitive science, you're going to run into many work of that nature. So what's the challenge for them? The challenge for them, you see, this is my summary. If you compare this one to the previous challenge, word by word, you see they're identical, but there's only one difference. You see here, we just say that some biological details may be irrelevant. Here we say some psychological details may be irrelevant. Okay? That also raises another interesting point. That is, if you talk with people who are just the general public, okay, they have heard about AI a little bit, but not too much. Or, for example, the reporters of some news media, they still believe Turing test is the working definition of intelligence or the field. Okay? Then they're going to ask you, within 5 minutes, they're going to ask you in an interview, say, are you going to pass the Turing test? And how soon you think a computer can pass the Turing test? Well, the reality is what? The reality is most of people in the current AI field, or even in the AGI field, doesn't really take the Turing test as their research goal at all. Why? For many people, exactly because of the reason I just mentioned. Turing tests actually say that if you can build a computer system which is you cannot distinguish from a human being in their, say, verbal behavior, then you will have to agree that that computer system is intelligent. Or in other words, the original form of Turing test in Turing's own article, if you read it carefully, he made it very clear that he is suggesting a sufficient condition for being intelligent. He made it very clear in his own word. It may be not a necessary condition. That is, if it behaves like a human, it's intelligent. On the other hand, if it's intelligent, it doesn't have to behave exactly like a human. That's the key point. Okay? If you take this as a working definition of intelligence, then you're asking it to be used as a sufficient and necessary condition. That's a very different thing from what Turing means himself. Okay? So the necessary part, actually, to many people, is way too much. For example, we know that humans very often make mistakes. Okay? Currently, computer already can be able to do a lot of things much better than a human being. So if you give an intelligent system a task in that kind of field, do you want the computer to behave just like a human, just try to be stupid? Does that make any sense? Okay. Many people say, oh, it doesn't make sense. That's kind of like cheating, okay? You can do better, but you don't. It's just you pretend to be a human. What's the point? Just for example, the simplest thing, numerical calculation, right? An ordinary simple calculator can do much better than everyone. Okay? So in that kind of field, it doesn't really make too much sense to simulate human behavior, or actually go back to human behavior. So that leads us to the next group of opinions. Many people say that, think about it, when you judge whether someone is smart or not, what do you do? Well, that's how this, the whole society is doing. Test, right? Give you some tough questions to see whether you can handle them. If you can handle them, you're intelligent. If you're not so much. Okay? So intelligence is, in our daily life is evaluated by a problem the system can solve. So it naturally leads to the conclusion that if we can build a computer system which can solve those problems which we all agree that need intelligence, okay, and you may have to say that the computer is intelligent. You see here the evaluation criterion is not exactly the same as the previous one because the computer may clearly not solving it in the human way. But it may be better than the human way. Okay? So this kind of system doesn't necessarily pass a Turing test because from first second you see there is no way for it to be a human. It must be a computer. Otherwise it cannot do it so well. Okay? But this group of people say that's what really matters, to solve the problem. So typical example, you see, including Deep Blue, and the more recent Watson system, or both from IBM, and many other expert systems. And those kind of things are very often said to be, represent a milestone of AI. Wherever you see that kind of evaluation, you'll see, oh, that's this group of people talking, okay? To them, the milestone is defined by the problem the system can solve. And that problem must be difficult enough for average human being. And also, we normally or ordinarily say that you need to be very smart to do well in those fields. And now the computer is doing better. So you'll have to agree the computer is very smart. So what's the challenge? The challenge is which problem should be used? You see, that's the explanation to the previous phenomena I mentioned about identity of AI. As soon as you set up a problem, okay, pretty soon someone or some company will develop a system and solve it. And when you open that system, if you really check the details, see there's really nothing new, okay? For example, in the case of IBM, very often they depend on their power-in hardware, specially designed, parallel processing, very powerful hardware. And then the algorithm itself is relatively simple, but they use, for example, complicated evaluation functions so that the given AI people the impression that we already know all those things, okay? It's just you guys have the money to actually build such a system. So what's the big deal? Where is the intelligence? Okay? So the problem may become, if you really try to define the field of AI in this way, it becomes a moving target. You set up a problem, say people say, oh, that needs intelligence. You have it solved, and people say they don't. Okay, that's not really what AI is about. Now let's pick another problem. On one hand, it's a fun game. Okay, we're always doing the most challenging thing. On the other hand, you cannot really build a theory on that kind of a moving foundation. Okay, so what is the point which separate intelligence system from, say, traditional or ordinary computation? Some people say, oh, really, you should not actually expect anything. Okay, they're basically the same. If that's the case, then we don't really have a field of AI at all. It's just computer application in various domains. Why bother to use those fancy labels like intelligence or cognition? So that's clearly not very satisfiable to many people. So now let's move to the other group of people who say, if you want to define intelligence by concrete problem, it's not a good idea. Michael. Oh, okay. You want to go back where?
You have the current topic at the bottom.
Oh, okay. Oh, I see. Yeah.
Yes.
The bad thing about that is you will know what I'm going to say after that. That's bad. Okay. But anyway, I can do that. Any other question? Suggestion? So. Yeah, this group of people, you see that this is actually the mainstream, the current mainstream AI. They say, okay, we don't want to define intelligence by concrete problem. We want to generalize them into different cognitive functions. Okay, we use this to separate AI from other fields of computer science. So if you pick a typical AI textbook, okay, and you check just their table of content, you'll see that's what they think. AI is different from the other domain because you see AI dealing with problem solving, knowledge representation, reasoning, uncertainty, learning, communication, That's, most of the current textbook organize the thing in that way. And you see, clearly it makes some sense. Those topics are not covered in other field of computer science. Clearly, also those things are a thing that you do see in normal human thinking process. And that's where, from where they're generalized. And also, there's some AGI project based on this kind of opinion, so that they try to develop a system which have all those functions integrated together in some way, so that you see, in a sense, if intelligence is indeed defined by a bunch of cognitive functions, then we can build a computer system with the same function, then it's AI. The problem I already mentioned. Okay, there are two issues. One issue is this kind of approach haven't explained very well what is the underlying foundation behind all those functions. Why those functions are called intelligence? How about some other functions? Okay, you cannot say everything, right? If you say everything, then you basically say AI is the same as a computer science. again, you're inventing a new phrase to name something we are already familiar with. It doesn't make sense. Another more important or crucial problem is we still have the same problem with traditional computer science. You see, again, that's a very interesting difference in attitude toward the computer. Many people outside the field think today's computer is already pretty smart. They can do this, they can do that. Ask a kid who just get an iPad, you're going to get that response. But for most of the people in the field, computer scientists, they know the current computer. It's very stupid. Okay, if you just get one character wrong, everything just become a mess. Okay? The system is highly rigid. If as soon as it runs into something not anticipated by the programmer or the designer, then that means trouble. Okay, clearly intelligence is not that. And actually a major motivation behind of AI is try to solve that kind of thing. Okay, so if your system, no matter what kind of fancy label you put on it, okay, it's still just kind of like the traditional computer, then the people have the feeling that something's missing. Okay, many people have the intuitive feeling that there is something fundamentally different between this and this. Of course, there are similarities. That's not the interesting part. The interesting part is there is a fundamental difference. Where is it? Okay, if you just say, okay, this is nothing but just many programs. It's just a matter of quantity. Okay, if you put 1,000, maybe 1 million programs together, you get this. It doesn't sound right. Okay? We have the feeling there's something more fundamental than the concrete functions. So that leads us to the last group. So that this group of people believe, just like any branch in science, okay, think about physics, chemistry, biology, blah, 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 all those fields have some kind of theory which is based on some basic principle. Okay. Using those basic principles, they explain a lot of phenomena. The phenomena can be very different from each other, but the underlying principle should be relatively clear, simple. Okay? Those people think we should be able to identify the same thing behind what we call intelligence for AI to really become a branch of science. It's not a whole bunch of small programs here and there, and you throw them all into the same computer system. Okay, there's something more fundamental. So those people tend to put more focus on different type, for example, logic or different type of mathematical model, and they're using some maybe a special type of philosophy to as foundation. And which include some of the examples, including my own work. Okay, so my own approach belongs to this category in general. I believe, like I said, intelligence can be explained from a relatively small set of basic principles. And from them, you can derive a lot of other functions, capabilities, even system structure. And the result will be similar to the human mind in a deeper sense, but not on the surface, not on all the details, okay? But in the underlying principle. Later I'm going to provide more argument for this conclusion. But just to be fair, I have to say that this way also face some major challenge. Okay? Why? The number one is, intelligence is way too complicated, okay, to be explained from some very simple principle. Okay, that's the common reaction most people in other category or other school will make. Okay, you guys are dreaming. Okay, there's no way for intelligence to be that simple. We don't know. Okay, but anyway, that's a challenge. If you take this position, that's a challenge you will have to face. Okay, you have to explain almost everything using a relatively smaller set of principles. Okay. So let's see whether I can convince you better by the end of my course that there is a hope to do it this way. So now I think you have a better idea about why I told you we don't have a commonly accepted definition of AGI. Okay? All the 5 group of people are there in the current AGI community. Okay? Again, if you are you can see that from the summer school. You can see that from, for example, the difference between my approach and the approach of Bengazo. Okay? Also, if you attend the AGI annual conference, you will see that's much more clear. Okay? And each of the 5 groups, you're going to see them in the conference. At the very beginning, I think it's healthy for the community to have different approach because even though I have my opinion, on the other hand, I have to agree it's way too early to decide who is correct. Okay, just like any scientific field in the early days, AGI clearly is still in its early days. Okay? We should encourage competition. Also, there is a reason for that to happen. Some people, especially the people who are not very familiar with the technical detail, they will suggest, why not you guys work together and just combine your ideas? Why not we cannot build a system which is similar to the human mind in all of the 5 aspects? Well, actually, I write a paper in the very first AGI conference, just argue against that. I just argue that's impossible. Okay? Because we are observing something from different angle, and you get different picture. And you're building a system according to that picture, and you get a different result. Okay? And especially the best way, if you think about it, I think I already touched some of those issues. The best way to solve a problem, for example, is not necessarily the human way. Okay? So you cannot really build a system which makes both this group of people and this group of people happy. There's different approach. Okay, and also you see to make something which make both this group of people and this group of people happy is not easy. Okay, but relatively easier. But to do something, for example, make this group and this group of people happy, that's much harder. Okay, you see, I put this sequence in this order with a reason. The reason is you see that we are moving away in this order from the detail of human intelligence. Okay, and this group of people, in a sense, is the closest. They try to kind of like to be as faithful to the human intelligence as possible. And this group of people moving a step away, say the detail doesn't matter, the behavior. Okay, these people move even further, and finally, we move to the farthest position. Say we don't care about any detail, okay, as far as you follow the same principle. So you'll see what is, just 1 minute. It's kind of like when you try to take a picture of something, okay, what is the correct distance between you and the object? There is no such a thing as a correct distance. At different distance, you get different picture. Can you get a picture which applies to all distance? I don't think so. Comments?
Which category do you put Van Gortz's work into?
You will see. Actually, at the end, I have a table where I put several, not everybody, because not everybody is a very large group. I made a table with all the several typical approach. You'll see I'm here, and Bengazo is here. But there is another dimension I need to explain. Okay. This is important because many of the traditional discussion or debate or controversy about AI actually happened in, it's caused by a confusion of different standards. Okay? So for example, if what I'm doing is here, you argue against me, say that what you did, I don't see a neuron there. That's not a valid argument. Okay? I'm not after that in the first place. Or you say, your stuff never passed a Turing test. Why do I care? Okay? But if I do suggest, I'm in this category, then the same argument will become a major issue. If you can actually prove I cannot pass a Turing test, even though I take a behavior definition of intelligence, that's indeed a big challenge to me. Okay? So in the future discussion, at least people in this group or in this room, now you should know better than the others. Okay? So when you try to evaluate something called AI or AGI, you need to ask one more question. That is, in what sense? Okay, it doesn't have to belong to exactly one of the 5 categories. Later we'll see some of the AGI approach is kind of like in between. Okay, they kind of like pay some attention to function, also pay some attention to, say, structure. That's possible. So what I'm saying is kind of like a more typical polarized position. But the situation where everybody agree. But in detail, no, we have very different approach, which face very different target. A metaphor I use is we are actually climbing different mountains. Okay, even though from far distance they may all look like overlapping with each other, but if you check the detail, they're not the same mountain. Okay, the best way to go here clearly is not the best way to go there. It depends on where you want to go. Okay, so that's the first question I want to explain in detail today, because that's the foundation of all the following discussion. And the second question is actually the answer to my previous third problem, that is how to do it. Okay. That clearly depends on the answer to the first question, that is where you want to go. Okay. After you set up your target, then you can talk about what's the closest way or the most possible approach to get there. But still, there's something in general we can discuss, which is, I just call them overall strategy. This is more for AGI, not that much for AI. Because AGI is supposed to, to do the whole thing. Okay? Clearly, everyone agrees intelligence is a very complicated thing. Even for the people who actually take a principle approach, you will still have to do it kind of step by step. Okay, there is a magic formula, that will actually solve a problem all in one step. That's impossible. So you see, from a scientific point of view, we can say there is a common principle. But on the other hand, as an engineer, you have to do it step by step. So how to do that? Here, again, you ask a different researcher, you get a different answer. I kind of like classify them into 3 major groups, okay, in terms of the overall strategy. The first one is what I call a hybrid approach. The idea is pretty simple. You see that all of those ideas are pretty simple. Yeah, certain level of description. It also sounds to make sense. Until you put them together, you'll see they're not the same thing. Okay, this idea is say, yeah, we agree that in the past 50 years, AGI field or AI field doesn't really make any major breakthrough in terms of doing thinking machine, but you have to agree that we have making some very impressive progress in different domains. Okay. And it's very easy to put together a long list of achievements. If you check AAAI website, talks about AI introduction. There are a long list of, now we can do this, now we can do that. And people say, okay, now is the time to put all those things together to get the whole thing. Okay? So the idea is to develop individual functions first. Solve domain-specific problem first. then put all the solutions together, and then you get the whole thing. A typical people who taking this opinion will be from the mainstream AI, but they have some similar idea with the AGI people. Okay, again, in the following AGI annual conference, you're going to see some of the speech which come from, in my opinion, that kind of angle. Okay, we are making parts, but so what? You have to make parts first, then you can make the whole. Okay.
Does anybody actually have any idea of how to do this connection?
Good question. We are going to work that out if you ask those people. Okay, we are going to work that out. We already solved part of the problem. You see, now we begin to hook machine learning with vision. Then maybe next time we can add robotics into the picture. Why not add reasoning later? Eventually, you have to do it step by step. That's kind of the answer.
But is anybody actually working on making these connections, or it seems to me like most people are just working on the parts?
Yeah, I agree with you. Yeah, but some people will say, well, we are not there yet, okay? But in principle, it can be done. The challenge or the difficulty is this. It's not only because nobody have done that. There is a reason why it haven't happened. It's just because all those parts, if we call it parts, are built according to very different theory. Theoretical foundation, they're not compatible at all. Okay? For those of you who have worked within the field of AI, to put two models together is not too hard. To kind of integrate them, to add a third one in is harder. How about 4 or 5? If you pick a typical AI textbook mainstream, you will see there are hundreds, if not thousands, of algorithms. Can you implement all of them in the same computer system? Technically, yes, you can. That's not the difficulty. The difficulty is to make them work together. Coordination. Okay? Because they're not built in the same way. It's kind of like if you want to duplicate a human being, okay? How about let's separate the work? You do the arm, he do the leg, okay? Leg, and that person maybe do the air. Eventually, we put that together to a human. It's not going to happen. Okay. So in the field of AGI, well, that's actually to a large extent why we want to start AGI as a separate field in the first place. Okay, we realize that even though some people in the mainstream AI have a similar, goal in the long run, they are going to do it in this way, and we don't think it's going to work. Okay. So if you really want to build something, you need to have an overall design to start with. Even if you want to build parts, you need to have an overall blueprint, so that the parts can be built accordingly, which will, to a large extent, guarantee that eventually they can be put together to work together. Okay? So that's kind of like the second group, what I call integrated system. Okay? So this system will say that we should start, well, you're going to hear about this word again. You need to have an architecture. That's the overall blueprint. Okay. And then you plug in different modules or different parts into the picture. Even though each of them can be built using different technology, then the overall architecture guaranteed to a certain degree that it will work together. Okay. This, you'll see here, I'm using Bengozo's paper as a representative argument for that approach. Well, that clearly makes sense. Okay, that clearly makes sense. But also, what's the problem? The problem is similar to the previous one. Okay, even though you have a deep overall architecture, to identify what are the parts is not that easy. Okay. Some of the work later we'll see. It's kind of like, you pick up a textbook of cognitive psychology and you see, oh, there is a chapter on memory. Well, clearly memory is important. So in my system, I'm going to have a memory, okay? And maybe more than one type of memory because psychologists tell us there are at least 3 types of memory. And then what? Then clearly I want to use natural language. So then I need natural language processing module, which is related to the memory. How about learning? We need another module for that. How about reasoning? We need another module for that. Then we have links between those blocks, which at the very beginning, clearly makes sense, but as soon as you go in deeper, you will see that all those functions are not that easily separable from each other. Okay. Concrete example, later we're going to address that with more detail. Can you really process natural language without learning and reasoning? In what sense there are 2 separate modules? Okay. So the problem about intelligence, what makes the problem of intelligence difficult, a major reason is kind of like everything is related to everything else. Okay, well, on one hand, you have to make some separation because you cannot do everything altogether. But on the other hand, every separation is not easy. It's especially arbitrary separation, even though it intuitively may make sense. You're going to see you run into trouble by decide what is on which side, how they are related to each other. Okay, so that's the difficulty faced by this group of people. And finally, I put myself at the end. But still, I will say, this is the majority of the current AGI community. Okay, for a reason. I understand. I fully understand, even though I personally don't agree. Okay. And finally, this is the minority in the AGI field, which is what I call a unified approach. Here the idea is, yes, we need architecture. Yes, we may have different parts. But the whole system, to a large extent, is based on one single theory or technique. Okay? But if intelligence is so complicated and an AGI system cannot be built easily, how can you use one thing to do everything? Well, again, of course, we agree that you have to do things step by step. But if you're taking this approach, the detail will be different. For example, later we'll see in my approach, it's one idea, in a sense. But I will still start in a simplest form of that idea, okay, to make a very simple system. Then what? They extend that idea to make it a little bit more complicated, and more, and more, and more. Okay? So this approach is more like you have a lot of circles, one within another, which indicating the process for you to make your system bigger and bigger, but they're all around the same core. Okay? So that's what I call a unified approach. Which I pick my own paper as a representative argument. Clearly, we are facing a problem that is, again, as I said before, you need to pick the technique very carefully just to make sure it's flexible enough, it's extendable enough to cover a large territory, even if maybe it's still not everything, but it needs to be pretty large for you to call yourself AGI. So,
Have you got clear about what this core system look like, or what this core system is?
What do you mean by causes?
You mentioned here
Uh-huh.
technical to start on a core system, that you the start point, the thinking principle. So have haven't got clear what it is. Yeah,
Oh, okay.
single technical stuff.
Yeah, yeah, of course. Yeah, since that's what my following lectures will be all about. Okay, so here today I'm just making this claim. I can do it. Okay, I know you guys don't believe me. You should not. Okay, if you already believe me, you're too easy to be convinced. Okay, in this field you need to be very careful about that. Okay, many arguments at the very beginning all sounds reasonable, but most of them is wrong. Okay, otherwise we already have AI or AGI many years ago. It's just all the previous ideas, even though they sound reasonable, there's some problem. Okay, so you need to keep a critical attitude toward everybody in this field, including myself. Okay, so don't believe me, but I tell you that's how my work is different from, for example, Ben Gozzo's work. Okay. Another aspect. So, okay, if you say that you want to use one technique or more than one, but what's the technique? People, some of you are more eager to, to pass this philosophical discussion, then let's go to the meat, okay, talking about the real thing. That's a long story, of course. Here, I only gave you a very brief list about the major techniques that currently used in AGI research. Guess what? They should look very familiar to most of you. Okay? You should already know all of them, or most of them. So some people will say, oh, that's just AI techniques. It's nothing special. Yes and no. Yes, the current AGI grow out of AI. So clearly, there's nothing come from nowhere. Okay? They're all based on the previous AI technique. The no part is, as soon as you set up your goal as AGI, you want to do the whole thing, you're going to see that even the same technology, okay, in AI and AGI are used very differently. Your focus will be different. Your evaluation criterion will be different. Your plan and the schedule later will see all different. So we don't have the time to go through each of them one by one, but hopefully we are going to go back to many of them in the following discussion. Okay. So the last part of this introduction is a list of what I call representative AGI projects. Disclaimer, they're not all of them clearly. And also, actually, even according to my opinion, that's not the best ones. Okay? But I picked them for a reason. My criterion is basically 3. You see, it's clearly oriented to AGI. It's not just solving one problem in one domain. Okay, that's AI. That's no matter how good it is. Okay, for example, you see clearly Deep Blue, Watson, and so on doesn't qualify just because of that. Okay, even though I agree they're a big achievement for something else. Okay. So AGI oriented. Second one is still very active. So I'm not counting the dead bodies in the history. Okay, everything in the following list are the thing that currently there are people working on it. And also, third one, already have ample publications in detail. Okay? That, by the way, doesn't make them more likely to be successful, but it will make them easier to be evaluated, at least. Okay? From time to time, you may have already heard someone on the internet claim, I have solved the AI problem, or I have solved the AGI problem. I have built the first one, the real AGI system. But guess what? I'm not going to tell you the detail unless you show me the money or something like that. Okay? I cannot say it's impossible. I just say I don't know enough to talk about those systems. Okay? So Bai has ample publication. Roughly, I mean at least one book, and say 30 and more journal articles and so on, just because AGI is big. Okay? Just 1 or 2 papers usually only cover a small part of it. So you see, I'm not discrimination against the more recent project. Okay, many of them are very promising. It just we can only talk about something we know a lot already. So in the following, according to that standard, I put together at least about 10, I think now it's 11 or something, project. For each of them, you'll see, for example, this SOAR. This link will link to their project website, okay, with where all the following things come from. And then I select two reference according to my own judgment. Usually the first one is a relatively brief introduction of the overall project for beginners to know what this is about. The second one is typically a book, okay, which give you a much more detail. And some of them say PhD dissertation or just at least 200 pages long, something like that. Okay. And all the following paragraphs are cited from the website, so they're not my words, that's their own words. I picked the quotation basically to address the number 1, number 3 question, that is, what's the goal? What do you mean by intelligence? How do you plan to do it? Okay. So you'll see this is one, this is another, and so on. I have a list. Clearly, we don't have the time, and also there's no need for us to explain each of them. But several people I mentioned here will show up this year in the AGI conference after the summer school, so that you should be able to meet some of them. And here, finally, is a rough classification according to my category about the research goal. I said there are 5 groups. Overall strategy, I said there are 3 types. And combination, you see that, yes, we haven't seen anyone in this hybrid approach which actually presents something which qualifies to be called AGI. Okay, but I leave them there as a possibility which I cannot rule out. Okay. Then some of the others, which is which. You can take a look if you're interested in some of them. And finally, there's some reference about, we have, the AGI conference have the tradition that all of our papers will be full text online. Okay, usually also have a video tape linked to it. Okay, so you should be able to go back to the very beginning of this field and see what everyone have been saying all the time. And this is the link to the journal, and this is to the society. Okay. So that's a very brief introduction about AGI. And let's take a 15 minutes break. Okay, then we will resume at 10:15. Then I'm going to give the second introduction, which is the introduction to my own project. Okay? All right, now let's take a break. Now I'm going to start the second introduction. This time is an introduction to NARS, which is my own AGI project. So as I said, this will be what this following 5 days are all about. Okay? So today I'm going to just quickly go through the whole project and just give you a big picture. Clearly, today I'm going to raise more questions than the questions I answered. But I will try to answer them in the following days. So, especially I want to connect this to the previous introduction about AGI by explaining a little bit more about why I picked this working definition of intelligence and why I picked this approach to achieve AGI. So the name of the project is NARS, which stands for Non-axiomatic Reasoning System. Yeah, it's about AGI. And it includes, as I said, result is 3 level, and it's a theory of intelligence. And guided by that theory, I have a formal model. And finally, there is a computer implementation. I'm going to talk about all 3 levels But clearly, given the time restriction, the focus will be on the first and the second. But we're going to say a little bit about the current implementation of the system. So the major design decisions, that's basically my more detailed answer to the previous questions. I said, first is the number one question, what's the research objective? Or what intelligence means to me, or to the NARS project. As I already told you that I take intelligence not as defined by concrete behavior or capability or even function, instead by some kind of working principle. Okay? Concretely, is this. Okay? If I have to summarize my work in one sentence, it's this sentence. That is, I believe the essence of intelligence is the principle of adapting to the environment while working with insufficient knowledge and resource. Okay? That's what I believe that separate intelligence from conventional computing. And later you will see that's also what differ my work from most of the other works in the field. So you'll see, accurately speaking, this working definition contains of two aspects or two parts. The first one is, I believe, intelligence is a form of adaptation. Or you can say it's some kind of relative rationality. It's a form of rationality. Okay? This linked to a separate journal article just on that concept. And we'll have more details I'll cover there. So that's the first aspect. The second aspect is the phrase insufficient knowledge and resource, which you are going to hear again and again and again and again and again, okay, in the following days until you're completely bored by that phrase. But still, there is a reason, just because that explains almost everything else. Okay? So, concretely speaking, what do I mean by insufficient knowledge and resource? With respect to what? Well, with respect in this context to the problem the system tries to solve. Okay. Some people say it doesn't make sense because as soon as the problem can be solved, the system must have the resource and knowledge for that. Okay? How can you say it solve a problem but still have insufficient knowledge or resource? Well, I will explain more about that. Okay? But here, at the very beginning, I just tell you that, concretely speaking, my insufficient knowledge and resource are defined by three requirements. Okay? The first requirement is this. The keyword is finite. That is, I assume a system has finite information processing capacity, especially, say, the number of processors, the amount of memory, storage, space, and so on. Most of you will say, oh, that's trivial. Okay, that's clearly the case. Every system is finite. How can you be otherwise? That's true. But if you think about the theory of computation or the theory of intelligence, later you're going to see, actually many theory, or most of the theory, in a sense, does not take that into consideration. Okay? They don't think about what if the system is running out of memory when I need to store something else. Okay? Whenever I want to solve a certain problem, what if my processor doesn't run fast enough? Okay? According to my opinion, a theory of intelligence needs to address those issues because that's a defining feature of intelligence. Okay? Finiteness of the body or of the hardware. That's number one. That's easy to understand. Second one, the system must work in real time. Okay, real time is a phrase you're all familiar with, but they have different interpretations. Very often it's interpreted as the problem has a deadline attached to it, okay, which clearly is a form of real time. But in my system, it's taken to be a more general. Some problem maybe not have a concrete deadline. For example, I ask you to do something and ask you to do it as soon as possible. Okay, that's also some kind of time pressure or time requirement, okay, but not as a deadline. It's just say that how long it will take for you to finish this process actually matters. Okay, I don't only check the final answer. I need that answer to be reported soon. Okay, if it takes 1 billion years, it doesn't really matter what you tell me at the end. Okay, so that also later we'll see change the problem completely. Okay, what if that explains why I say insufficient knowledge resource. For a given problem, you know a pretty good answer. But on the current hardware, that may take, say, 5 hours to run. But I must have an answer within 10 minutes. What are you going to do? Okay, a conventional computer cannot do anything. You cannot run the same process, then interrupt after 10 minutes and still expect to get anything. Usually you get nothing. But clearly, human mind can work in that context. Okay? A typical human mind will kind of like say that, yeah, I can do it in 10 minutes, but you cannot expect my answer to be perfect. Okay, just I don't have enough time to think about it carefully, but I can still give you something. That's what I expect my system to be able to do. Okay? So, and also in real time means the problem may actually show up in any moment, rather than when the system is ready or waiting for it or is idle and have nothing else. Okay? What if the system is working on something and then something else show up, which also demand immediate attention? A truly intelligent system, according to my definition, should be able to handle that without a crash. Okay? So that's the second keyword, that's real time. And finally, the keyword is to be environment. Meaning what? Meaning new problem, a new knowledge may show up at any moment, which I already mentioned. Also, it may have any content. For example, a piece of new knowledge may contradict to the system's previous belief. The system may run into big surprise. It should not be killed or crashed by that. Also, more interestingly, the problem the system is required to solve may go beyond the system's current knowledge scope. That's actually the most directly related to the AGI part. Okay? It's general purpose in what sense? It's general purpose not in the sense that the system knows everything, can solve every problem. I don't think that's possible. Okay? But it's general purpose in the sense that when I design the system, it's not designed for a special type of problem in a special domain. Okay? The system may run into problem I never anticipated when I designed the system. It's open to that. It's not going to be killed by a novel situation or novel requirement. And also, adaptation means clearly the system should be able to learn from its experience. Okay? That's easy to understand. But the direct problem that raised by this requirement is if you want the system to work in that kind of situation, guess what? By definition, there is no way for the system to guarantee its answer will be absolutely correct or optimum. Okay? Think about it. If it can guarantee the correctness, that basically means you have already know everything you need to know to solve that problem, right? If you don't know everything, how can you guarantee the result or the solution you provide to be correct? You can only say that that's the best guess I can make. I don't know everything, but I gave you my best guess. In a sense, that's what I mean by relative intelligence with respect to the knowledge requirement. Okay. So in non-technical word, I try to build a system which clearly doesn't know everything with respect to the problem, but can always make the best guess according to what it knows. If it only know very little, the guess actually is, as you can guess, okay, usually wrong. But still, according to my definition, that's the right thing to do because, you cannot do better. Okay. So that's the knowledge aspect. How about resource? The same thing. Okay. What I'm looking after is not a system which provides always optimum solution. But the best solution can be found given the current resource restriction. Okay. For example, if the system's memory is only large enough for 1,000 statements, later we will see what that means. Also, if the system only have 5 minutes to make a response to a certain question, what's the best answer? Okay. And clearly, if for the same problem, if I give the system 10 times more memory and 3 times more time, I will expect a better answer. Okay? So the evaluation about whether a certain answer is valid or reasonable actually depends on not only the problem, but also the current resource restriction. So in a sense, what I'm looking for is also, you can see it as some kind of optimization, but this optimization will take the current available knowledge and resource into consideration as a restriction. Okay, within that restriction, what's the best thing the system can do? So later we are going to say much more, but first I want to mention, I believe why I want to take that position. First, I believe this definition or this working definition of intelligence is consistent with our understanding of intelligence in general. Okay? I claim that the human mind indeed has the ability to do that to a certain degree. Okay? In almost every domain, with certain exception. For example, mathematics is an exceptional situation. Okay? In most of the other domains, our conclusion we cannot really prove is absolutely correct. It just is correct as far as the available evidence goes. And also, you usually cannot prove that's the absolutely optimum solution. It can only say that's the best one you can find within a given time constraint. Okay. As far as my system can do that, I'm happy. I call it intelligence. Okay. So that's why I said it's one way to argue for. This will solve the problem of the identity of AI. I already mentioned, if you define intelligence by concrete problem, then it becomes a moving target. As soon as you solve that problem, it's not intelligence anymore. But you define it in my way, we don't have such an issue. I can clearly explain later using terminology in computer science why this one is not intelligent. It's not because it cannot do anything. Okay, current computer can do a lot of things, but it cannot work in that environment. It cannot work with a different, knowledge or background with different time constraint and so on. Okay. So I believe if we define AI in this way, we're not going to have those troubles. And also, it gives the system, later we'll see, consistent foundation behind all of its various functionality. You will see that different cognitive functions are actually developed to just dealing with this reality. See that I don't really, according to my definition, AI is not really a branch of computer science anymore. Even though it's using computer science technology to implement, theoretically speaking, it's actually the opposite. To me, computer science study how to solve a problem with sufficient knowledge and resource. Sufficient knowledge means you have an algorithm. Sufficient resource means you have the time and space to run that algorithm. Okay, as far as that's the case, that problem is solved, theoretically speaking, in computer science. What computer science cannot handle is either for a problem you don't have an algorithm in the first place, or you have an algorithm in a sense. For example, you can do exhaustive search, right, for almost everything, but you don't have the resource. You cannot afford the resource for that algorithm. To me, that's where we need intelligence. Okay. Again, we're going to go back to that. So it's related to computer science, but not the same thing, especially theoretically speaking. It's related to cognitive psychology. Later, you will see that many of the cognitive functions can be derived as strategy to survive in that environment. On the other hand, it doesn't have to behave the same as the human mind in all the details. It doesn't have to pretend to be a human. Okay? Especially because you see, if its behavior is produced nothing but from the available knowledge and resource, then for a normal computer system, it clearly will have different knowledge compared to a normal human. So its behavior should be different. Okay, if a computer actually pretends to be me, that doesn't really make sense. It doesn't have my personal history. Okay, where does that behavior come from? Okay, so it doesn't look like me. That's really more reasonable for the computer to be intelligent. Okay, so in that sense, we can explain why it's related to cognitive psychology, but not the same thing. It's not just what people today call cognitive modeling, and many other fields which we will explain. So that's my working definition of intelligence. I actually have several papers just on that topic with more detail if you're interested. And then let's just pretend you have agreed with me. Okay, that's a proper goal. Probably not your most favored goal, but it's a reasonable goal. Okay, how to do it? And then I said I use a unified approach. Why that's the case and why that's the best approach for me? Well, you'll see that's clearly related to how I define intelligence. I define it as some principle. Okay, then what? Then the computer implementation or the formal model become you're looking for a concrete way to realize this principle. Since this principle is clearly defined, it's supposed to be behind everything else, then your system clearly should be unified around nothing but that principle. Okay? So that if you figure out a certain way to implement that, then they will become your core technology in the whole project. Then you may need some secondary technology. Later we'll see I do need some secondary technology here or there, but clearly the whole system is organized around that core technology. Okay? You just need to give it a richer and richer content rather than just stay at this philosophical level, say insufficient knowledge or resource. Well, that phrase cannot clearly solve all the detailed problem. You need to say, okay, that's what I mean. That's how I measure it, okay, with more and more details in the following discussion. So you'll see that later we'll see I'm using a single technology as the core, and even though I use some other technology in a secondary level to help it. And then the question will be, okay, what technology? From the name, you have already seen that I'm doing a reasoning system. So it's based on logic. Okay? But many people's first reaction is, no way, it's not going to work. Okay, logic AI is dead a long time ago. And we already know that logic is too rigid to simulate intelligence. Why not use neural network, which sounds, more probably closer to your goal? Blah, 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 blah. Why not use evolutionary computation or machine learning algorithm, which all sounds probably closer? Okay. To pick logic actually as the core technology is a place where many other people doesn't like my approach. But I do have a reason. Because I believe logic in the original and the most general sense. Think about it. What is logic? Well, it's nothing but the regularity behind the thinking process. Okay? Or the principle, or the law of thought. Okay? So at that level, it's very natural to say, okay, what you're suggesting is to actually looking for the laws of thought in human mind, then formalize it, then implement it in a computer system. If the laws of thought already taken the insufficiency of knowledge and resource into consideration, then they should give you a system that satisfies the principle. Okay? So in that sense, it should be pretty natural. And also for AGI, you will see that a logic-based system has several major advantages. First, it's naturally general purpose. Okay, logic is a symbolic system. It doesn't assume anything about the application domain. It can be any domain. Okay, so you already have that part handled. On the other hand, if you're doing a concrete computer system, for example, say neural network. Neural network are very flexible. Actually, I learned a lot from neural network in terms of how a system should be built. But its current technology, it's very hard to be used as a general purpose design. Okay. For a special, say, pattern recognition problem, yeah, it's pretty easy. You just train a neural network. But the general purpose system, well, can you train a neural network for each possible scenario and then put them all together? Well, again, there's a big problem about integration. So it's just an example. Okay, later we will see more about neural network, the good and the bad about it. But the logic-based system, you don't have that issue in the first place. A second thing about logic, which make it suitable for my purpose, is, you see, intuitively speaking, the idea is what? Is I want the system to be able to always do the right thing according to its available knowledge and resource. Okay, this is how much you know. You want to solve it. And also the context change from time to time. And also you have to make real-time response to the changing environment. Okay, if you are doing a proof of a mathematical theory, even though it's very important, and now you realize there is a fire, you need to run away, okay, rather than sitting there and continue your proof. So that because of that, you see a traditional algorithm-based solution is not going to work. That's a topic, again, we're going to mention again and again. Algorithm-based solution is for what? It's under the assumption that the problem will repeat and your solution will also repeat perfectly. That's what the algorithm is about. Okay?
I get it right that from this current this core system this core system could be named as intellectual system that can use intelligent and unintelligent techniques just as tools, just as we do use business intelligence and computers and so on.
Yes. Yes. Actually, we are going to talk about that with more detail later. Here, I'm not talking about how it uses other technology. It's just, at the very beginning, I will focus on my own technology. Okay? But the big picture, you're correct. It can use unintelligent technology as tool to solve problems. Okay? So why I use a logic? Well, the logic, good thing about logic is you're not allowed to do arbitrary things. Every rule needs to be justified according to some kind of semantics so that you can say this is the correct rule. Okay? It just later you will see clearly I'm using a very different semantic foundation compared to traditional logic. Okay? Especially the foundation will be, need to satisfy my requirement of insufficient knowledge of resource. Okay? But still it's a logic in the sense that every step is justifiable, in the sense that it's the correct step given that knowledge of resource. Okay? So it will try, what I want to do in this point is try to solve the dilemma I just mentioned. If you follow a given algorithm for a given problem, okay, you have the repeatability and the predictability. That's desired. But you don't have any flexibility at all. Okay, because, well, that's what algorithm means. Okay, well, I'm talking about classical algorithm. Later people will say, how about random algorithm, blah, 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 blah. Other stuff we'll talk about that later. Okay, just at least in classical sense. Algorithm means you always use the same solution for the same type of problem, which is good for computer science, but it's not good if you have insufficient knowledge resource in the sense that, for example, you may have a slightly different problem, or you may have a different time pressure, which doesn't allow your algorithm to run to the end. Okay? So, on the other hand, if you're doing a reasoning system, in a sense, well, a reasoning system still, if you implement it, it's also a bunch of algorithms, that's for sure. Okay? But now the scope and scale are very different. You don't have an algorithm for the whole solution. Okay? You have many teeny tiny algorithms. Each of them is for one single inference rule. Then how to combine them together to give a solution that can be decided at the runtime according to the current environment, according to the changing factors in the control mechanism, which we will learn, we will say later. Okay? So a reasoning system gives you a pretty good balance between the rigidness of individual steps and the flexibility about how to combine those steps together into a problem-solving process, compared to, either you have an algorithm or you don't in computer science. Okay? Clearly, you don't want to do it randomly. On the other hand, if you follow the same fixed algorithm, it's too rigid for the given environment. So that's another reason. Again, I hope you appreciate it better at the end of the course, not at the moment. But I want to give you that reason at the beginning. Okay. So then, what kind of reasoning system? Well, clearly it will have to be very complicated. Okay? Again, that's the picture I already mentioned to you before. The idea is, instead of trying to solve all the problems in one step, I will start from a core logic, then I'm going to do extension of it step by step. Then in the following, I will have a more detailed structure about that. Okay? But all of them are based on the same foundation. They're going to implement the same philosophical or mathematical, or whatever you call it, ideas involved. So you see, you can still do it step by step. You can still, well, you will have to build the system part by part. Okay? But all those parts must be based on the same consideration. Okay. Then when the system is finished by itself, then you plug in other stuff on top of it, but that's a slightly separate story. Then, okay, once again, let me assume you have already convinced, okay, we should do a logic. Then the next question is what kind of logic? Clearly, I agree with many people already said, if you just directly do mathematical logic, it's not going to work at all. AI history have showed that. Not only that, a small extension and modification of mathematical logic still not enough. For example, non-monotonic logic have been studied in AI for many years. They are making progress, but there are some fundamental problems that haven't been solved. Okay? In my opinion, they are not moving far enough in terms of their fundamental assumption. Okay? They're adding something new in the right direction, but they want to stay with the traditional logic in almost everywhere else. To me, that's not going to work. Okay? So you see, I'm making a much more radical move in terms of compared to the other existing non-classical logic. Okay? By doing what? By build completely on the assumption of insufficient knowledge resource, which in a sense is kind of like the exact opposite compared to traditional logic. You see that the traditional reasoning system, especially the study AI in theorem proving, okay, is based on that is you have some truths given to a system, typically called axioms, right? Then you have a bunch of inference rules which are valid by definition. Well, actually, that's the definition of validity. Okay, what is a valid rule? A valid rule is a rule that only derives truths from given truths, right? Roughly speaking. So you can derive theorems from given axiom, which is guaranteed truth. And then what? Then if you want to implement it in a computer system, then you need to provide some deciding procedure or algorithm or proving algorithm, right? Wherever the user gave you a statement to be proved, you run that algorithm, which will tell you yes or no, meaning that whether it's a theorem or not, okay? If the system is decidable. So that's clearly the opposite to my insufficient knowledge and resource resurrection, okay? If you agree with me, you will see clearly in this system there is no axiom. Okay, everything can be wrong. Why? In what sense? In the sense that if you're open to future experience, your future experience may tell you that whatever you believe, it can be wrong as far as the system is truly open. Okay. And also on resource aspect, that no matter how efficient your implementation is, okay, it may be not enough as far as it's a fixed algorithm. Okay, the computational complexity may be not low enough for some real-time application. Okay, so you'll see that's exactly why I pick this name. So later I realized that what I want to do is exactly the opposite of axiomatic reasoning system. Okay, because at that time I don't have a better name, I just call it non-axiomatic reasoning system. Okay, maybe not a very good choice, but since I have been using it for many years, I will stay with it. Even though I guess I can equally well call the system something like adaptive logic or something like that. Okay. So also you'll see the logic I develop is called now or for non-axiomatic logic. Yeah, and by the way, that also related to my thinking about what is wrong with traditional AI. Clearly, that I mentioned, many traditional symbolic AI approach failed to reach AGI, which make AI turn to something else. If you say AGI is possible, then one challenge we have to take is you have to explain what was wrong. And you can explain, you have to try to explain why you're not going to repeat the same thing. Okay, what makes your approach different from what people have tried before? Okay? So clearly, the traditional symbolic AI is not working, and I've been thinking, what's wrong? Is the problem, you see, in the late 80s, early 90s, many people say, actually the problem is in the use of symbols. Okay? Symbolic approach is not good enough, it's not flexible enough, so you should use some so-called sub-symbolic or non-symbolic thing. And some people say neural network is the solution. Some people say, symbol grounding problem. You should actually do robotics, which will solve the problem. Later, I think I'm not convinced completely by any of those arguments. I think the problem actually is not in the use of symbol, but in how to use a symbol. So also the same thing for formal systems. Some people say formal system is not a good idea. Some people say logic is not a good idea. Later I realized none of them apply. Actually, the bad idea is axiomatic system. That's a bad idea for AI. But there's a good idea somewhere else, for sure. For mathematics, for logic, that's very good. But for AI, try to build axiomatic system is the bad idea. So that's why I named my system as the opposite of that. Okay? So here's a little bit more detail in this self-contained introduction I have to add. But for this lecture, you don't have to fully understand what I mean here, okay? Because later we're going to say much more about that. It's just very roughly speaking, we indeed have some kind of symbolic system which use a term as kind of a symbol to name a certain concept in the system. Then the terms are related to each other and form some statements, okay, about conceptual relations about the concept of the system. And clearly, as you can already guess, I told you that there is no absolute truth, so those statements will become true to a certain degree. And also, this degree indicate what? It doesn't really indicate how much it fit the reality. Okay, that is, in my system, truth value is a measurement of evidential support. It's not using in the traditional model theoretic sense to indicate whether your opinion agree or disagree with the reality. Okay? So I use truth value for evidential support. And furthermore, what is the inference rule? The inference rule will be, from a statement with given evidential support to new statement using, the premise, the existing premise as evidence. Okay, so it's a kind of like how to transfer evidential support from one statement to another, eventually to the final conclusion you want to make. Okay? So that's kind of the reasoning or inference rules the system will use. Later we will see more details. And then, okay, that's kind of like the logic part. Okay, you see, typically when we talk about logic, informally, you mean what? The formal language, which we will introduce, the formal inference rules, which we will introduce, and also the semantics, which will define what truth means and what meaning means in the context, which we're going to talk about. Okay? So that's half of the story. The other half is how to really implement that logic in a computer system, which you typically will need to handle the memory and the control. Here, memory clearly in a computer, you need to have a way to keep all the available knowledge. You also need to keep the existing problems as well as intermediate results for them, and so on. Okay? And the control mechanism need to decide step by step what promise to use and what inference rule to use. Okay? Even though there is, in theory, there's many possible direction you can move. Why you want to move into this direction rather than that one. Okay? That's what the control mechanism of a reasoning system need to decide. So under my assumption of insufficient knowledge and resource, you see these two parts, the key is the memory is always in short supply. Time is never enough. Okay? If that's the basic assumption in the first place, what kind of system do? What is the best thing or the best decision the system can do? Okay? For example, I know for a certain concept, in principle, there is 1 million of statements, but my memory only allows me to store 1,000 of them. Which 1,000? If when I solve a certain problem using that concept, I only have the time to think about 10 of the 1,000, then which 10? Okay? So that's the issue that will appear only under the assumption of insufficient knowledge and resource. Otherwise, it will be trivial. You just remember everything and take everything into consideration. Okay, that's optimum by definition. So you'll see that in my system, I will rule out that possibility from the very beginning. Even though, of course, some people will say, you're making things too complicated. What if the system is really running into some simple problem like what is 1 + 1 = 2? Okay, you know, if that's the situation, yeah, clearly you can say the system indeed have sufficient knowledge and resource to solve it. But that's a special case. Okay, I don't want to design my system with respect to that special case. I would rather design it against the problem which I take to be normal, that is much harder than that. Okay? But it doesn't rule out the possibility that the system may run into some special case, which indeed have sufficient knowledge in a certain sense and resource. Okay? But I'm not going to discuss that at the very beginning, just because that's trivial. Okay? So the general assumption is you don't. So that's how the system is designed. And then here I have a top-level architecture figure to show you very roughly how the system looks like. It looks like something like this. But this picture is not really that different from what usually how a reasoning system is structured. Okay? But I will explain. So you'll see that a rough working cycle consists of 6 steps, which is explained here. Okay, on the top level, very roughly speaking. So you'll see the system in terms of components, major components, it's very simple. You can say there are only 2 or 3 of them, depending on how you count. You see, this is the memory, which is a place where you store the system's current knowledge, which, as you can see, that roughly speaking is some kind of conceptual network. You have some concepts which are related to each other. No surprise, this kind of thing have been used in AI for many years in many different forms. What makes this one special later we'll see is the detail. Okay, what kind of nodes are there, what kind of links are there, and so on. But the rough picture, it's just a conceptual network. Okay. Then what? Okay, then it's nothing but some concepts and some relations. Some kind of weighted, directed graph. Then the input, each input is a sentence. Okay, each sentence is nothing but some concepts related to each other. So in a simplest situation, you can say a sentence is always 2 nodes related by a link. Okay, there may be different type of links. So the system's input or the system's experience, there you see, is nothing but a stream of those statements. Okay? So that those kind of things will get into the system, first into some kind of buffer. You can either think the buffer as part of the main memory, or you can think of them as separate. It doesn't really matter too much. Okay? And that's why I said that you can think the system as two parts. It's just a memory and the inference engine. It's just the part of the memory is a buffer. Okay? Or you can say that's two separate things. It doesn't matter. Then what? Then this kind of box is what I call a control point. That's some kind of selection mechanism. Okay, it will selectively allow some of the content of the buffer to be added into the memory. Why that selection is necessary? Well, you can guess now. It's insufficient resource. Okay, you cannot think about everything, even though those things have come into your system in the buffer. Okay. So you have to pick something which you think may be important or relevant to remember. So that thing will go, those things will go into the memory clearly. Roughly speaking, it will change the memory. It will change the topological structure by adding some new nodes and some links. And maybe it will remove some existing links and nodes, which we will talk about in the future, so that the memory gets changed by the new input, which also is a common practice for AI system. And then what? Then at each moment, you also select something from the memory to process. Okay? And this time, my system is more restrictive. They say that roughly speaking, in normal situation, each time you only pick two links. Furthermore, those two links must share a common node. Okay? So, for example, you can pick this one, and you can pick this one and this one. Something like that. Okay? And those two will be fed into the inference engine, which you can think is a big box with all the inference rules built in. You see, the memory grow and shrink, it will change over time. But the set of inference rules is fixed over the lifetime of the system. Okay, that's the logic. This logic itself is not learned by the system. It's built in. It's innate. Okay, but the memory, the content of the memory, that's the domain knowledge. That's the system learn over time. So at the very beginning, later we'll see in the examples, the memory is completely empty at the very beginning. Okay, everything comes from outside. Everything at any moment in the memory can be modified. So that's why I said there's no absolute truth.
Are you using any heuristics from the environment anywhere here?
Yes and no. Clearly, we do have something called similar to heuristics, but later we'll see it's very different from traditional, say, heuristic function, that kind of thing. Okay? If you say heuristic, by heuristic you mean the system is making guess, that guess may be right, may be wrong, yes. But it's not a built-in set of heuristic function which will be applied to different domains. Okay. So anyway, in each moment you pick something, you feed it to the inference engine, and the logic will decide. You see here there's no flexibility. Okay. If you feed the same thing, and you always get the same thing out because the logic is fixed. The logic say from this one you can only derive this one, nothing else. Okay? So that the logic will derive one or usually more than one conclusion. And those conclusions will be put, again, together with the new input into the buffer. Okay? And so some of them will go back to the memory, but not all of them. Okay? I didn't draw that detail. It's just something will actually, some of the input will just die in the buffer or removed from buffer without getting into the memory. Okay? Why? Because, as I said, the buffer has a fixed size. That's another finiteness of the system. And the memory also has a fixed size. Okay? That means if you're pushing too many things into the memory, and something have to be removed to make space. So now you can already guess the system has a forgetting mechanism, okay, which actually, in contrary to many people's intuition, I believe to be able to forget is absolutely necessary for intelligence. Okay? To remember everything actually is a disaster. Even though very often people take forgetting as a negative aspect of human cognition. Okay? Later we will say more about that.
Excuse me, sir. I also have a question.
Sorry.
Okay. So, step number one, no problem. Step number two, selected tasks are inserted into the memory. But in the architecture, we don't see the selection process.
Of course not. That's a long story. We are going to spend a lot of more time. Yeah. This is just a quick run through of the whole thing. I don't try to explain everything. Yeah.
And in step four, so and feed to the inference engine as a premise. So that would be some kind of non-axiom. The premise is a non-fixed axiom.
Yeah. It's just the system's current belief, basically.
Okay.
You can take every line as the system's current belief. If you believe this, you believe that, and what can be derived from that, according to this logic. Yeah. Again, how to make that selection? Well, that's a story we push to the future. It's just there's such a thing. Also, you'll see some of the result will be selected and reported to the outside. Here, the outside can either be a human being, currently that's the case, or some other system which will be easily implemented, or maybe directly the world if this one eventually is embedded in a robot. Okay, we are going to talk about that in the future. For now, we just say there is an environment which exchange information with the system in terms of sentence of a formal language. Okay. So that's a very rough, high-level picture with all the details to be filled in the future. But hopefully this gave you a top-level, again, architecture point of view of how the system works. So yeah, I also have some discussion about situated cognition. That's the hot topic in cognitive science, and the embodiment issue, which we are going to talk about in the future. I already said, compared to traditional logical system, the most important change I made is actually the definition of validity. What is a valid conclusion? Okay. Again, we are going to go into more detail. And also, what is rationality? In this system, rationality doesn't really mean always make the correct solution. Here, correct means to be confirmed in the future. Here, there's no way. And actually, I don't think any human being can do that. Okay, we just make our best guess. Our conclusion, if you think carefully, all the conclusions are actually justified not against the future. We don't know the future. It's justified against the past. Okay, but we use the past to predict the future, even though we know, in principle, the future and the past are different. It just, there's nothing else we can do. Okay? So at least that's my philosophical assumption. So a little bit more detail about the logic part, which will be the focus of my short course in the summer school. Okay? The overall structure is something like this. For the future discussion, as I said, I'm doing a unified approach So it's only one logic, okay? But it will be built in many different layers. Actually, in my current design, there are 9 layers. Okay? So each layer is built upon the previous one by adding more grammar rules, so the language becomes more complicated, more inference rules, so the system can derive more things from the given. Okay? And also later on top, you see that we can also change the semantics to give it a different interpretation. For example, some of the sentence will actually be interpreted as a procedure, so that it can be hooked with some sensory motor mechanism and a robot body and so on. Okay, that will all be covered. So this is the more conceptual separation than implementational. Okay, meaning that I'm going to introduce it one by one, but in the current implementation, actually there are several levels implemented all together. Okay, so you don't have to say which rule is which rule in terms of implementation. But conceptually, this is either for people to understand the system. Okay, so that's what I'm going to do. So I'm going to go through this one by one, and actually, if we go back to the schedule, you will see. Okay, today is the introduction, and tomorrow and Friday, I will basically talking about level 1 or the foundation layer of the system. One day for the logic, and the second day will be on memory and control and computer implementation. Okay, so after this week, you should know, the base level, how it runs. And then I have 3 lectures in the next week to talk about, you see, layer 2 to 4, that's one group. 5 and 6, that's another. And the top layer, 7 to 9, that's the final piece. Okay, so that will be how I organize my lectures. So go back, and now you don't need to know which is which. Okay, we will talk about that in the future. So here I have a description about the relationship between this thing and the other AI work. Most of you already have AI background, so just because what I have told you, just based on that, you can already guess. This thing must be related to this and this. Yes, all of the guess are correct. Okay, that's part of the nature of AGI. As far as you're doing AGI, your work must be related to almost everything else in the previous AI research. Okay, it's just some relations are stronger. Some of them is just remotely related. Okay. So here I only list the logic part. Is clearly related to almost all the previous discussion, or most of the previous discussion in non-classical logic, especially about inductive logic, probabilistic logic, fuzzy logic, relevance logic, and so on. Non-monotonic logic I already mentioned. Also, it's related to set theory, to traditional mathematical logic for sure. Also, top layers, I get a lot of idea from logic programming, like Prolog and that kind of thing. And also, I didn't mention it's closely related to many non-symbolic approach. Actually, I almost completely agree with the philosophical foundation of neural network. I agree with the idea completely. I just don't like their technology. Okay? I think it's too rigid, contrary to many people's belief. Okay? I will try to convince you that my logic will be actually more flexible than most of the neural network. Okay? Even though it's a logic in a sense. Other things also, you see evolutionary computation, say genetic algorithm, I learned a lot from them. Okay? But you don't see it as part of the system. All of the things are integrated deeply into the basic foundation of the logic. So, also later you're going to see that many of the traditionally separate cognitive process are actually deeply integrated into the system. For example, I will say aloud about learning and reasoning. I will convince you that at least in my system, reasoning and learning is exactly the same thing. It's the same process. You're talking about is using two different terminology, which is okay. Each terminology is going to focus on a different aspect of the process. Okay, in that sense, you can talk about them in two different ways, and both of them are valid. But it doesn't mean you have a reasoning process and you have a learning process, then communicate with each other. There is no such a thing. It's just one process, which is also responsible for problem solving, for decision making, for prediction, for everything. That's why I call it a unified approach, not an integrated approach. Okay, because the integrated approach, you typically have a different module and which are linked to each other. Okay. Again, more detail will be talked about in the future. Control structure, I will say more about that on Friday morning. Implementation, some of you may already eager to see, okay, it sounds reasonable, but can you really do that? Okay, you can check my code. Okay, AGI, as I said, until you make an implementation, no one will take you seriously, right, in the field for a good reason. So that I have already implemented several prototypes, of course, far from the whole thing. If you ask me to show you the whole AGI, of course, I don't have it. Okay? But I think I have made some progress. There are several prototypes implemented. And the most recent source code online, and also this is an open source project now. Okay? So this will give you that. And also, you can run it as applet. Yeah, it's just you need to do that kind of thing. No. Later we're going to, again, we will have to wait until Friday to make sense of it. But if any of you want to give it a try, I have a whole bunch of examples already on the website. You can use those examples to try the system. Then you can add your own examples. It's not really difficult to do. Okay, and then on Friday we are going to spend some time on that. If you want to start that early, try it by yourself. You're welcome to do so, and I can give you some more information later. And also, yeah, you can ask Sophia. Yeah, she is my student at Temple University. She has worked with me for several months, and she is reasonably familiar with the system. So you can ask her for help. Okay, just to show you how to write what each symbol means. Even though later we are going to reach that point, I will say more about that. Okay. Today, I just want you to believe me. Yes, we do have a working code. Okay, even though it's far from the whole picture, but I will show you some fundamental idea which make this system completely different. Okay, I cannot promise you that you will be completely convinced. This is the right way to do AGI, but at least you will see this is completely different from everything else you have learned. Okay? In certain aspects. So here I have a bunch of publications on my website, and there is more than 40 papers. And here I select some of them just for the beginners. Just otherwise, there is no way for you to go through all of them. So the brief introduction. Comprehensive description, at least two of my book. One is the recent one is the published a couple of years ago on different stage. Of course, the recent one is more up to date. Also more focused on the logic part. Okay. Also, let's see. That's the major reference we're going to use here is this file, beside my lecture notes. Okay. This is basically a draft version of the whole book. Okay? But it's not a published version because the publisher is not going to allow me to do that. Okay? But it's pretty close. And also you'll see that I used it last year in Reykjavik in the previous AGI Summer School, and I'm going to use it again here. Okay? So it's online available. Okay? So the whole book is here. But clearly, on the other hand, you'll see it's a big project. It has been carried out for many years. So I cannot promise you that only in 6 days I can answer all of your questions. No, there's no way. Okay. Actually, last year I was on sabbatical. I offered a 1-semester course here at Beijing University. I still haven't been able to cover everything. Okay. So it will be still brief, but I will try to focus on what I believe to be the most important part. Okay. No promise to answer all the questions, but hopefully to stimulate some of your own thinking in this direction. If anyone wants to get more involved in the project, you see it's open source. It's always welcome, okay, for the other people to get involved. Or if you say, oh, clearly it's not going to work, well, let me know. Also, I welcome all the criticism. Okay. So and then in the following, 5 days, you'll see that each day I'm going to use one of this page and to talk about certain layers of the system, and at the end I will tell you which chapter in the book you should read, and also I have linked to my working example on the website, so hopefully you can actually try it on your own computer, and you'll see this is the actual input-output produced by the system, which doesn't make any sense to you now. It's okay. I will explain. Okay? Yes. Yes. Yeah, that's the formal language, which I will start to introduce next time. So that's pretty much what I plan to say tomorrow. Okay, just today. Basically, to give you a big picture. Especially, I hope to give you some motivation, some curiosity. Say, oh, I don't think it's going to work, but since I'm here, I will pay some attention to this guy to see, how can he explain it or convince me. Okay, which I will try to do. I think we have some description about lunch, right? Especially for people who are not familiar with the university, and tell you how to avoid starvation here. Then we will resume in the afternoon at 2 p.m. Then Chris is going to start his talk.
Firstly, welcome to Beijing University. This is one of the best universities in China. And this used to be part of a palace, so it's a very beautiful campus. If you have some time during the break, you can just walk around and enjoy yourselves. My name is Kata, and I'm one of the volunteers here. And now we are showing you a new map, which we have already distributed among you. If you don't have one, please show us so we can help you get one. And the new map adds some information about the restaurant, and we can explain it to you all. And before that, I want to say that maybe for some of you, it's the first time for you to come to China, and you might be startled because not everyone speaks English here, even in the capital city of China. This might cause you some inconvenience, but actually I want to explain it. It's because the English is not an official language in China. And what you can do is actually it's lucky of you because you are in such a good university, so you can find some students and ask them for help. But what you can really do is trying to slow down your velocity of your speech, so you can speak slower so people can understand you. And you can ask your questions with some gestures, body languages, so they can help you more. And you can give some patience so they can explain themselves in maybe poor English. So this is a new map. And so actually we have some restaurants. Firstly, here, maybe you live in Xihua Hotel, so it's actually outside the southern western gate of Peking University. So along these streets, there's a lot of restaurants, but most of them are local foods. So actually, you can try KFC on this street. Maybe most of you can enjoy that. So the second one, and if you live in Zhongguan Xinyuan, it's actually outside the east gate of Peking University. There are several restaurants there, and they offer English menus, so it might be convenient for all of you. Just around this place, and maybe it's actually in the dorm area of the hotel in Wanxingyuan. So inside our campus, all of the canteens only serve food to students and faculty in our university. So actually it's not, all of them are not accessible for all of you. So what you can do is trying to buy some easy food, either in here, section 4, it's Subway, so they serve hot dogs. You might be familiar about it. So here, if you cannot find it, you just show this to anyone who knows Chinese, so they can tell you how to get there. And also, there is a cafe here, just actually next to the Subway. It's a cafe. So they serve spaghettis, pizza, and noodles, everything you want, rice, everything you want, you can find there. And also, there's one. This one here. This one here. And this is this one. So all of these restaurants will be underlined, so you can differentiate between them. This is also a cafe. It's called a Paradiso. And if you can find some foreign students, you can ask them for information about Paradiso. They definitely know about it. And this is a cafe. They offer cafe, and they offer bread and cakes, so you can enjoy yourself there. And I want to explain that this building, this classroom, is actually a little special because it's off the main road in this campus. So it's a little bit difficult for you to find those places, even though this seems very clear on this map. So what I can do is just go outside. Just go directly outside this building and turn right, and you find someone and ask them about the information. Actually, for this first time, we can lead you there. We can lead you to anywhere you want to go. But for the next time and for the next days, it's on your own. So that's all. Thank you. So anyone that have this new map? I'm sorry, any questions?
Money machines?
Okay, Michael.
Where are money machines? ATM machines?
Okay, it's actually, it's actually in the